welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. I've been debating over the last few days where to go with this episode, and I apologize, I'm a little late getting this week's podcast out. There's a couple different places where I thought about going with this, because whenever you touch on this topic of morality and the origin of morality, it does open the door up to the question of, well, then, if there is a God, then how can God allow this? And it allows that discussion of how can a loving God allow these things? And I think quickly we get into an area where we're not quite ready to go yet. And let me explain why I say that. I want to touch base on this question of Richard Dawkins, where we started this discussion of morality. And one of the views, I think, of morality that kind of drives this atheistic ideal in some ways. And I'll explain what that means here in a second. Let me use Dawkins' quote. This is from Dawkins' book, River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life. Dawkins said this. He said, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. So there is no good and there is no bad. I find it an interesting statement because Dawkins certainly reviles the concept of God when he goes in that direction and fights vehemently against something that he firmly believes doesn't exist. And I understand why. He's saying if God existed, then God would have to explain all of these things to me. But I love C.S. Lewis's quote, countering this idea. And Lewis gets down to this point of addressing exactly what Dawkins is talking about. Is Dawkins right that there is no evil and there is no good? There's simply DNA and we dance to its music. I love C.S. Lewis's point in this, and this is from Mere Christianity. And Lewis is looking back and addressing a time in his life when he was an atheist. And he says this, he says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? He's addressing Dawkins' point, and he's saying, I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense. It's not just that there's no evil and no good. Lewis is looking at it going, I was appalled by the condition of things around me, and I recognized that there was evil and there was good, and the reason I knew evil was because I was comparing it to good. That's what he's getting at. He continues, a man feels wet. Let me jump back just a tiny bit more. It says, what was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because a man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God would collapse too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. He looked at it and said, I'm right for believing that that I should be indignant when I look around the world, that there is an absolute right, that there is an absolute wrong, and I'm not wrong in believing that. And if that's the case, then Richard Dawkins can't be correct, that there is no evil and there is no good, and there's simply DNA and we dance to its music. Lewis is saying, I was in that same place. And when I really thought about it, I came to the correct conclusion, that can't be right. So I think Lewis hits on something very, very important there. And this is the fundamental problem. And this is where we get into that dangerous place of saying, well, then, if there is a loving and just God, then how do we answer all of these issues, and why does he allow that? The reason I want to stop and not go any further and just wrap this up around this question of morality, and then I want to go in a different direction, is because the why part. If there is a God, then the reason why he's doing something is incredibly important when we analyze what he's doing. If we understand the why part, the how part makes more sense. And I think we know that's true in a lot of different things that we do. I think sometimes when I look back on why we did certain things, it made how we did them much more understandable. My folks had a saying when we were growing up, 5 years from now, does this really matter? Is it really a big deal? And if the answer was yes, then this is a line you kind of drew in the sand when we were raising our kids, and we kind of adopted that same rule. Is this going to be important in 5 years? And why, when we looked at that from that perspective, through that lens, when we looked at how we were raising our children, then it might have helped other people on the outside to understand, well, this is what they're doing, because we understand the why part, because this is something that's important in 5 years. When you're dealing with toddlers or teenagers, you need to know those kinds of things. So I want to get into the why part. And so that's going to take us down the path of looking at Christianity and things like that. And we're going to wrap this up tonight and go down there and look at this as we wrap up this question. So what have we learned as we've looked at moral values? Number one, I think what we've shown is objective moral values do exist. And we recognize that from a couple of different ways. Number one, none of us is really okay with Dawkins' example of dancing DNA. We're just not. We know we have that issue. And evolution cannot be expected to explain how we got here. Remember Richard Dawkins' quote as we were looking at all of this. Dawkins, when he looked at this question of evolution, he had to ultimately back away from it of being explanatory to where our moral values are today. And in the end, some of this he said, he looked at a couple different scenarios, and he said both of these different scenarios are misfirings, Darwinian mistakes, blessed, precious mistakes. And so he said, well, we really can't explain why we behave this way in certain areas, other than to say that we've kind of gone off track from a Darwinian perspective. When we looked at Darwin's explanation of these things, Darwin appealed to our more noble nature and kind of stepped away from the social Darwinianism that he recognized was a very real possibility in all of this. Lewis addressed this issue, and I think he really summed it up well for us, that there's got to be this third thing. It can't necessarily just be explained from a Darwinian perspective. When you have two competing impulses fighting against each other, what is that third thing that settles between the two? He said it this way, but feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help whether you want to or not. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside of you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing which tells you that you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between the two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot be either of them. Lewis is right. You may be able to point to the idea of certain traits that would be handed down generationally that you might say, well, this is more of something we could say is a Darwinian response. The need for safety. I need to preserve myself. I need to be safe. And therefore, that need for self-preservation. You could look at that from a Darwinian perspective. But Lewis correctly makes the argument. There is a third thing out there that cannot be explained by either of the other two, the herd instinct or self-preservation. And that third thing that drives them gets into this idea of objective moral values, or that thing that's built inside of us. So we recognize that evolution was not really a good answer in this. We also recognize that morality by consensus simply did not work. And we've spent a lot of episodes talking about that. And I would encourage you to go back and look at those episodes, especially the last episode where we talked about what do you do when two moral systems collide with each other? What do you do in that situation? Again, talking about the Holocaust and talking about what the Germans did, Lewis put it this way. He said, the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring both of them by a standard, a third thing, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other. In this case, it was the question of the Allies' idea that murdering 6 million Jews was wrong versus the German idea, the Nazi idea, that murdering 6 million Jews was perfectly fine. So how do you judge between the two? What is the why? And the why part is what Lewis is getting at. He's getting at this idea. It's not just two different consensuses. You don't have two different consensus that have been reached by two different groups of people. You have to judge between them. There has to be a why. We all know the Holocaust is wrong. Why is it wrong? Lewis is addressing that. But the standard that measures two things is something very different from either. You are, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral values can be truer and those of the Nazis less true, there must be some real morality for them to be true about. And that wipes out this idea that, well, we can just achieve morality by a consensus. What happens when the consensus goes wrong? There is a real right and wrong in all of this. So when we pull those together, that consensus building doesn't work, that an evolutionary perspective really doesn't explain things like we think it should, the third idea that objective moral values do exist, and we recognize they exist in all of this because we know and recognize that murder is wrong, and we can say why the Holocaust was wrong. Because built into us is that third thing. Built into us is this idea that we have been made by a creator in his image. And when we look at that creator and we take it from the perspective of we have been made in his image, we recognize that ultimate value that we possess, that thing, that the why part of why the Holocaust was wrong, that we are made in the image of God. And so when we followed this through, we came back to the original conclusion that we looked at in the very first podcast on morality from William Lane Craig, who said, and this would be the moral argument, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. However, objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. And I said during that first episode, this is going to begin helping point us to who that creator might be. And I want to walk you through briefly where we've gone and where we're going in all of this. Number one, the cosmological argument. As we look at the cosmological argument and we walk through the beginning of the universe, what we see when we look at, for example, Albert Einstein's work in his general theory of relativity and the impact that Hawking and others have had on that general theory of relativity, the special theory of relativity, and specifically the Bohr-Guthrie-Lincoln impact on looking at that special theory of relativity. In light of the fact that we have an expanding universe, what we recognize is, I'm not saying the only explanation, but the best explanation that we see on the table for how we got here today is some sort of a Big Bang type event, that the universe is not past eternal, and that there was an absolute beginning point to the universe. We're not going to talk about how many years ago that was or what it was. As a Christian, I would refer to it as a creation event. Scientifically, the common phrase used out there is the Big Bang. However you choose to look at that, the inescapable part is that the best explanation scientifically is that there was an absolute beginning point to the universe, and that we have been around for a finite amount of time. Now, that causes enormous problems for specific belief systems down the road. And I don't just simply mean atheism. Materialism and atheism, yes, it causes enormous problems because it forces an atheist or a materialist into the corner of trying to argue for some really out there theories or trying to get around the idea, maybe renaming nothing and calling it something else, or trying to look at this question and say, well, there could have been this or there could have been that, but ultimately you're arguing for everything coming from nothing. And scientifically, that's a really hard argument to make. But it also has theological implications. Pantheism. when you look at pantheism and you look at some of the ideas such as Hinduism or Buddhism, Mormonism, where you look at ideas where the deities that are worshipped are part of creation, and there is not an original creator, that gets to be very problematic. And that gets to become a real issue that starts to close in on some of these religions where you look at it and go, no, wait a minute. There is not, one of the things you could point to as well is maybe it's an oscillating universe where the universe collapses and expands and collapses and expands and is born and reborn and born and reborn and all of these things. That doesn't work scientifically. And so the evidence that we've seen points to an absolute creator of the universe who exists outside of time, space, and matter, because all of those things would have come into existence at the beginning of the universe. So deism, and particularly theism, walks away from that as the most likely explanation, an intelligent designer based on what we've seen cosmologically. Again, I know I'm doing this at a high level. There's lots of episodes in the past for you to go look at on that topic. Then we come to fine-tuning, or the teleological argument. And what we've seen since Fred Hoyle began this journey, 60, 70 years ago now, looking back at that question for the creation of carbon and how Hoyle saw the incredible fine-tuning that would have been required. And actually, you could even take this back to Einstein trying to mess around with the cosmological constant. But what we've seen is a growth of knowledge that points to the fine-tuned conditions at the beginning of the universe that has created a universe that is so incredibly friendly towards life. And again, where does this put certain worldviews? Materialism and atheism is found just clutching at straws, trying desperately to hold on and arguing for the multiverse and arguing for all sorts of things that seem increasingly unlikely, trying to get around the mathematical impossibility that fine-tuning injects into the problem. Deism also starts to look less likely here too, because with deism, it's a increasingly less personal God. And what we see is the very personal touch of a creator as we get into this. You can make the argument on deism both ways. But deism quickly stands out as the most likely option here. Again, not saying it's the only option. I'm saying it's the best choice of the possible choices that we have when we consider both scientific and theological options on the table. It also starts bringing into question panspermia and things like that, which again, this moves us into our third option, our third issue that we've seen, and that's the design of life. And we've spent so much time in the last 12 months talking about life and how incredibly unlikely it is. And it's not just unlikely. We've talked about how Darwin's model just fails across the board in so many areas. The fossil record or the complexity of the cell. When we look at all these things that Darwin's model simply cannot explain or predict, the information contained inside DNA, when we look at proteins, when we look at amino acids, when we look at how basically, again, mathematically impossible it is to see these things randomly come together to bridge the gap between the chemical and the biological. When we see all of those things and put them together, again, naturalism is just left grasping at straws and hoping for chance. And at each step along the way, you notice the best answer for naturalism gets worse and worse and worse, ironically, based on the most current scientific information out there. It's funny, when I look at comments in the comments section on these podcasts, most of the scientific comments are from science that's 40 and 50 years old, if not older. And it's just desperately hanging on to this idea that somehow, if we just have enough chance, it'll all work out, because we've excluded God as a possibility. And if we've gotten God out of the way and declared him out of bounds, well, we can't ever really look at that again. And only a fool would ever consider thinking about God. And that's just not a good answer. And it's not one that we should point to. So again, when we look at that, panspermia gets wiped out as an idea just because of the complexity of life happening once, let alone twice. And then the impossibility of intergalactic travel, given the constraints that we know, looking, for example, at Einstein's special theory of relativity and what it would take trying to travel faster than light and everything else. It's a terrible idea and a terrible option. Deism, again, here is really in trouble, because when we look at the complexity of life and what it would have taken to get life to where it is today on this planet, deism doesn't make a lot of sense either. But theism, specifically Christianity, Judaism, and potentially Islam, would be your groups that come out of this. And I think Islam has a lot of problems on this as we go forward. And so we're going to focus less right now on Islam as we go forward, especially when we look at the moral question coming up. We've talked about the problem of consciousness. And again, materialism has huge issues here, just like we've seen in all the rest of them. When we look at consciousness, we recognize we have free will, and we recognize so many problems differentiating between the brain and the mind that materialism, again, does not put a good answer on the table. And the most likely answer that we find is that we are a soul. What we find is that we're more than just the gray matter between our ears. And so what we see when we look at that, again, is that there is a spiritual component to this. There is more to us than just being a wet robot or something like that. In the end, what we see when we looked at consciousness is that it pointed us to a creator. And I would argue, again, it points us to theism specifically rather than deism. And lastly, as we've looked at morals, what we've seen is pointing to that idea of objective moral values. I think this is where Islam drops out and has problems. I'm not going to get into that heavily right now. We'll do that later. But this is where we see between Judaism and Christianity, the question comes to the table. Okay, so if the best answer when we look at all of these things, and we've been building this case, and from the very first episode I've said the strength of the argument is in the journey. And through the journey, what we've seen is that the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the biological argument for life, the moral argument, and the consciousness argument, as we look at these 5 areas together, they all conclusively point to the best explanation, not the only, but the best explanation being that we are the product of an intelligent creator. The question now becomes who? And I think what we've seen as we've talked about this is pantheism has real problems with a universe that's not past eternal. That when we look at other faith systems and when we bring this question together, as Mormonism did at other areas, things like that, when we bring all of these things together, what you're pointing to is the God of the Bible. Now, the question becomes, how do we answer that? And this is why I wanted to wait to address some of the why questions. Well, if God is really real, if there truly is a God and he's the God of the Bible, then how could God allow all of these bad things to happen? But this is where I want to look at the why part. And so what we're going to do next is transition into how do we know that the God who created all of this is the God of the Bible, is Jesus Christ. How do we know that that's this? God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. How do we know that that's the case? And what we're going to do is we're going to begin looking at that in the episodes to come. We're going to change gears. We're going to shift over to what does all this mean? Translations of the Bible, and how do you recognize historical facts versus science fiction like the Da Vinci Code and things like that? How do you pull all of that together? And that is what we're going to address in the episodes to come. And I think when we get to the end of that, then we can look at the why questions together. Questions about hell, questions about pain and suffering, questions about all of these things. If we understand the why part, it doesn't make hell an idea that we like. It doesn't make pain or suffering something that we're okay with. But if we understand the why part, and if we look around us and we're honest about what our role that we play in all of this is, then maybe, just maybe, the answer makes more sense. And that's what we're looking for in all of this. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope that you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can reach out to us at prooftoggrace@yahoo.com via email. You can find our episodes, our podcasts, on iTunes, Spotify, and on YouTube. And you can find helpful information out on our website at prooftoggrace.com. If you've got questions, if you've got comments, please email those to us. I do sometimes look at the comments section, but I try not to look too terribly hard because, well, you've read the comments section, you know what it's like. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.